Vincent Kennedy McMahon was born on August 24th, 1945 in Pinehurst, North Carolina, to Victoria and Vincent James McMahon, the famed promoter of the NWA's Worldwide Wrestling Federation. However, Vince did not meet his father until he was 12 years old because Vince Sr. left the family when he was just a baby and took his older brother Roderick with him. Vince went on record to say that throughout his life he had several stepfathers, and he even went by the name Vince Lupton during his youth. The Lupton surname came from the most significant stepfather of his childhood, Leo Lupton. Vince gave a quote a few years ago stating that he wishes he could have been the one to kill Lupton because of how violent he was. Violence and poverty defined a young Vince McMahon's childhood as he slept in trailer parks, was often bullied in school, and had a rocky home life. Vince even spoke about being sexually assaulted by his mother and other teenage boys throughout his childhood. To think, this is where the ruthless nature of McMahon was developed. That all changed when he met his father, and in his own words, Vince fell in love with his dad and the two became very close. There was an obvious disconnect between them due to the time missed, but that did not stop the two from developing a pretty good relationship. It was like 90% of a relationship. Vince knew that they could never get to that 100% mark. It's kind of difficult too when your father is just not around for a significant portion of your childhood. The trials and tribulations of children that grow up in broken homes and poverty often can define and even defeat people. However, a select few, and this seems to be a common trait for a large number of successful people in America, can rise up above some of those challenges of their youth and do something great with their life. For Vince McMahon, that something was pro wrestling. He knew when he was exposed to the carnival wrestling his dad promoted that he had found his calling. This is the story of how a self-made billionaire rose from the bottom of the system and created a multi-billion-dollar global organization with a vision that not even his father believed in. The story of Vincent Kennedy McMahon is one of controversy, power, success, and the American dream. Upon meeting his dad, Vince would spend summers in Washington, D.C. with Vince Sr. and the wrestlers of the WWF. The WWF, as it was known as the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in those days. And some of those wrestlers were Gorilla Monsoon, Bruno Sammartino, and Pedro Morales. But there was one wrestler in particular. This wrestler was Dr. Jerry Graham. Jerry Graham was the founder of the fictional Graham wrestling family, which included superstar Billy Graham and Eddie Graham. Vince loved Dr. Graham and has often referred to him as his favorite wrestler of all time. McMahon was infatuated by Graham and would hang out with him when he could as a teenager. Graham would drink and drive, run red lights, and light cigarettes with $100 bills, as Vince said. McMahon thought he was the absolute coolest. Vince Sr. did not like this. He told his son it was because Graham was dangerous and reckless, thus making him a bad influence for a 14-year-old boy. Granted, while those are all valid reasons, perhaps Vince Sr. did not like Graham because he was working with the FBI as an informant in a case brought against the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA was sued in 1960, 34 years prior to Vince McMahon being sued by the feds in the steroid trial. Several wrestlers accused the elder McMahon of conspiring with Jim Crockett Sr. to monopolize wrestling and prevent wrestlers from joining other territories to earn money to feed their families. Like father, like son, as the saying goes. Regardless, McMahon would hang out with Graham when he could. Graham would become a huge influence on McMahon as he dyed his hair blonde at one point to be like him. And he may have inspired some of McMahon's choices in top stars like Hulk Hogan and Lex Luger, as they both resembled Graham. Eventually, after getting into trouble like stealing cars and chasing women, Vince Sr. had no choice but to send his son off to military school to teach him discipline. McMahon enrolled in Fishburne Military School in Waynesboro, Virginia, where he would eventually graduate. While in high school, his mother introduced him to the love of his life, Linda McMahon. She was a member of the choir at the church his mother attended, and they fell in love and got married a few years later. McMahon tried for the first of many efforts to convince his father to let him become a wrestler, to no avail. Instead, his father insisted that he become an accountant or a lawyer. He did not want the ruthless, mob-like life of pro wrestling for his son. Vince obliged and attended East Carolina University and graduated with a degree in business. After college, he was again turned away by his father to join the WWF. So Vince tried his hand as a salesperson among other odd jobs. None of those jobs would stick, and roughly a year or so after graduating from college, McMahon would secure a role as an announcer for his dad's promotion. Just 2 years later, in 1971, he would replace commentator Ray Morgan as the company's lead play-by-play guy, which he continued to do well into his tenure as the owner of the WWE. It's key to expand here for a minute as to why Vince Sr. did not want Jr. to be a wrestler. Sr. came from the old school way of thinking that taught the wrestlers and promoters to not interact with each other in the ring. By interacting with wrestlers in the ring, Jr. could cause wrestlers to become jealous or envious of the promoter's son being favored. In order to keep his business aligned properly in his mind, Sr. thought it would be best for Vince to stay on the sidelines. After a few years as a commentator and announcer, Vince was given a major opportunity by his dad. That opportunity was for Vince to promote small towns in Maine and other parts of the Northeast that the WWF would run in between marquee shows at the Garden. Vince ran with this opportunity and began expanding his role within the WWF and as a promoter. He'd promote concerts, sporting events, and even promoted Evel Knievel's infamous Snake River Canyon jump. Yeah, Evel Knievel would play a large role in Vince McMahon's rise. For those of you who don't know, Evel Knievel was a famous stuntman in the 1970s. He got really famous after a crash at Caesar's Palace when he attempted a 141-foot motorcycle jump. After seeing Evel Knievel nearly die for our entertainment on American Broadcasting Company, McMahon thought to himself, "I need Evel Knievel, pal." The year is 1974. Vince McMahon is 28 years old, living in a trailer park with Linda and Shane McMahon, barely scraping by financially while spending his time promoting sea-level shows in Maine. It's safe to say that Vince saw a lottery ticket in Knievel, while Knievel saw a fool with a rich father in McMahon that he could con into promoting his death-defying jump at Snake River Canyon. The United States government would not allow Knievel to jump the Grand Canyon as he originally intended since it was public land, and they did not want someone dying at a famous landmark. Vince spoke to Knievel about promoting his event after flying out to Montana to meet him and his wife, where Vince witnessed Knievel, quote, berate his wife and neglect his children. And he still decided to go ahead with the promotion. Knievel sold McMahon the dream of having 1.8 million people flock to theaters to watch the event on closed-circuit television to go along with 50,000 people in attendance, live in Ohio. McMahon, happy as hell, picturing himself hitting it big, making more money than he ever dreamed of, went to talk to his dad about his idea. Surely his dad, who had been promoting fixed pro wrestling events for years, could spot that his son had been getting worked. But then he agreed to fund 50% of the event, likely out of respect for his son's ambition and fierceness to make something of himself. As expected, the event flopped when Knievel ejected himself from the rocket prematurely after legitimate fears for his death creeped into his mind mere seconds into the stunt. He parachuted to the grounds of the canyon as only 15,000 people watched in attendance and less than 500,000 watched on closed-circuit television. Knievel escaped with roughly $500,000 while the boxing promoter that Sr. hired to protect Vince, Bob Arum, made out with $150,000, leaving Vince holding the bag. McMahon and his family were left in $250,000 worth of debt and filed for bankruptcy just 2 years later. One thing we know about McMahon is that he rises higher when faced with immense pressure and adversity, which is exactly what he did. He honed all the knowledge he gained from promoting a closed-circuit event and would use that knowledge when he promoted WrestleMania 1. More on that later. Vince did not do much following the failed promotion of Evel Knievel's latest stunt. He regrouped and saved his money for a few years before plotting his next move. Sr. did not always see the vision that Vince laid out to him, a vision of expansion. McMahon saw that their territory possessed resources that others simply did not. Resources that were found in their own backyard. New York City was the heart of the WWF. It was the heart of entertainment at the time as well. There was the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Garden, Broadway, and so much more at their disposal. Vince knew that he could use this to his advantage, and he tried to get his dad behind the idea of taking the company national through syndication and closed-circuit television. However, Sr. was comfortable doing what he knew best and did not want to disrespect the alliance. Respect was everything, and so was the alliance. The territory days were mob-like, as I said. If you messed with one, you messed with them all. It was an old adage of a man's honor. McMahon finally raised enough money to start a company, Titan Sports, which would be the WWE's parent company for years throughout the Golden Era. After founding Titan Sports, Vince presented a plan to his father to buy the WWF. This plan included Sr. and his business partners Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Scanlon, and Phil Sacco. The deal was a pretty sweet one for Vince. While his father did not directly hand him the company via inheritance, he did not make it too difficult for his son to inherit. In total, McMahon paid roughly $1 million for the WWE. Even in 1982, when the purchase was finalized, that number was considerably low. By 1982, McMahon had helped his father expand their business, increase ratings, and draw big names like Muhammad Ali to perform for them. They were the most successful of the territories and were surely raking in millions of dollars in revenue. Vince paid his father in balloon payments, and as part of the deal had to employ his 3 business partners for life, which he did. Most famously, Gorilla Monsoon stayed on as a commentator and on-screen personality until his death in the late 90s. If he had missed even one payment, however, McMahon would relinquish control of the company back to his father and partners. As I said, the company was making money hand over fist at the time, so making these payments was an ordinary task. What would transpire after McMahon gained control of the company is what would leave many within the wrestling world upset with the younger McMahon. Vince has gone on record in several interviews stating that his father would not have sold him the company had he known for sure what his son was going to do with it. So why did his father sell Vince the company, you may ask? Sr. had become terminally ill with cancer and knew that his days were numbered. Perhaps he knew all along what Vince was going to do, and Vince, ever the showman, plays up that narrative of disobeying his father's wishes for the cameras. The expansion began when McMahon pulled out of the NWA in 1983. Shortly followed was the poaching of talents like Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, and Ricky Steamboat from other territories. The other promoters became angry at Vince and even pleaded with Sr. to talk to his son about his tactics. Allegedly, the two had a meeting in which Vince became upset at his father and told him that he worked for me now, and that he was going to do what he wanted to do with the business. To which Sr. replied, "Okay, that sounds good." Vince's expansion of the WWF would prove to be scandalous, starting with the acquisition of Hulk Hogan. The way he had Hulk Hogan debut was just straight up disrespectful to the old guard, but was absolutely genius from a broader perspective. The AWA was seen as legitimate competition to the WWF because they had big stars like Hogan, Jesse Ventura, and Bobby Heenan. They also had a television deal. One thing they lacked, though, was the financial resources that were afforded to McMahon due to working in the largest market. Essentially, McMahon phones Terry Bollea and asks him what his vision of himself was, and then told him he could make him a huge star. Movies, commercials, action figures, you name it, pal, Vince McMahon could offer it to one Hulk Hogan. Hulk told Vince he'd love to come over in 1983, but he had dates to do with Vern in the AWA as he was booked until the mid-1984. Vince not only offered a substantial pay raise, but also paid Hulk to no-show his bookings, an offer that Hulk simply could not refuse. This resulted in one of the most significant moments in wrestling history on December 27, 1983, as Hulk Hogan would make his WWF debut at the Chase Park Hotel in St. Louis, Missouri. This was disrespectful for several reasons. One, the Chase Park Hotel was a cornerstone of the original NWA and was considered a sacred arena for the territories. On top of that, Mean Gene Okerlund and Dr. David Schultz of the NWA would also make their debut. Vince McMahon was a real G. Not only did he pay Hulk to no-show his AWA dates, but he also debuted Hulk in a treasured NWA arena along with 2 other top AWA talents. Those in the territories could not believe that a bunch of New Yorkers would come into their town, in their arena, and run a show with their top stars. Now here is where things get a little spicy. A day prior to Hogan debuting, the Iron Sheik would win the WWF Championship via forfeit from then-champion Bob Backlund, thus creating the concept of a transitional champion. This move was made for the sole purpose of having Hulk defeat a bad guy for the WWF Championship, as a babyface versus babyface match was considered taboo at the time. Iron Sheik was a great heel as he was playing up to real-life controversies in Iran. He'd shout Iran is number one during matches, among other things. So it was safe to say that Sheiky Baby would be a great opponent for our hero, the mighty Hulk Hogan, to conquer. It's safe to say that Verne Gagne, like the other members of the NWA, took Vince's advancements into their territories personally. Gagne took it to such a point that, according to legend, he offered the Iron Sheik $100,000 to break Hulk Hogan's leg on national television during their WWF title match. Not only that, but he said that he was going to take the WWF title back to the AWA. Now, this is certainly a fork in the road moment, to say the very least. It is arguably the biggest what if in wrestling history. What if Sheik had decided to take that offer and break Hogan's leg? Would that have put an end to Vince's vision? Perhaps. The world will never know, as Sheik ultimately did the right thing. As Sheik put it himself, he was grateful to Vince and Vince Sr. for believing in him and making him a star and champion. So he decided to not take the big payout in the short, but instead opted to tell Vince about the offer so he did not hear it from anyone else. Vince was appreciative of this and took care of Sheik by offering him a spot with the company for as long as he could make it work. Sheik took the smart, long-term option and got paid by the WWF for several years and made a decent living for himself. It is a fun visual, though, to imagine Iron Sheik breaking Terry Bollea's leg for real on live TV. That would be a clip worth watching a million times over. Iron Sheik offers a hilarious tale about this in a shoot interview. If you can find it, it's certainly worth a watch. He refers to Hulk Hogan as a, quote, no-good jabroni and a, quote, gold digger, among other things that I cannot put in this video with good faith. Hulk Hogan also told this story on Joe Rogan's podcast. Now, on principle, this story just lost 15% of its credibility just because Terry Bollea told it. Nevertheless, there are more than enough credible sources that have confirmed the story on record for me to believe it. This is not the only instance of the promoters of the NWA being sick and tired of Vince McMahon's antics at the time. One legendary tale of an attempt to stop McMahon's expansion of the WWF by any means necessary comes straight from the mouth of the greatest commentary in the history of our great sport, Jim Ross. According to Ross, he was at an NWA conference in sometime around 1984, a conference where several of the big promoters at the time, like Bill Watts, Eddie Graham, and Verne Gagne, would convene to discuss wrestling. As the story goes, Jim Ross was sitting in a bathroom stall taking care of some business when in walks 4 of these said promoters. Now, Ross has never gone on record to just exactly who these 4 gentlemen were by name. These promoters are having a mini conference while Ross softly lifts his feet up so the promoters cannot see him. Ross goes on to witness conversations between these men centered around the notion to, quote, off Vince McMahon. That's right, these promoters were so disgusted by what Vinnie Mac was doing that they actually plotted to have him killed. Obviously, this plot never came to fruition as Vince is still alive and well, counting his sweet, sweet TKO money. No further details are out there about this story that I could find at least, so needless to say, it is a folktale. A folktale that even McMahon himself has heard from Jim Ross. During his appearance on the Pat McAfee show last year, Vince actually told this story to McAfee and his audience. Unreal. He then went on to joke about receiving so many death threats that they don't even bother him. Now, as to whom the promoters in questions could have been, Jim Cornette speculated that he could have seen Ole Anderson being one of those for sure, while Bill Watts was also a strong candidate. Just imagine if Ole Anderson or some other promoter actually put a successful hit out on Vince's life. Man, the wrestling world is just so fascinating and kind of scary at the same time. Vince used several underhand tactics to attempt to put the other promoters out of business. Well, to some they were underhanded, while Vince himself simply looks at his tactics as competition. Perhaps McMahon was so comfortable doing what he did with his father's business due to their lack of connection from his father abandoning him as an infant. While they were close, I'm sure Vince always looked at their relationship as one of friends versus parents. I can't imagine what it was like to not have a father growing up, so I won't speak on that too much. It just seems to be the case from an outsider's perspective. One thing is for certain. Vince's rough upbringing no doubt brought him the ruthless qualities necessary to do what he did and withstand the amount of hate and threats that he did to become the most successful wrestling promoter of all time. One fascinating what if also involves Bill Watts. According to Jim Cornette in a tale told on the Jim Cornette Experience, Bill Watts was close to landing a partnership with Ted Turner that would have appointed Watts the head of creative over WCW to go along with a massive television deal landed by Turner. The story behind this is one of controversy surrounding pay-per-views. The NWA saw an opportunity to make a ton of money on Thanksgiving Day with Starrcade 1987, and Vince did not like this, so he threatened to pull WrestleMania 4 from the cable companies. In hindsight, it's pretty funny that this threat actually worked. I mean, what would Vince have done if the cable companies just said, okay then, we won't have WrestleMania this year? It would have been interesting to have McMahon's bluff called. Cornette alleges that instances like this would not have happened if Watts and Turner had gotten into business together, because Ted Turner was really close with the television companies. This isn't the only Starrcade that Vince tried to ruin though, as he also tried to ruin the original Starrcade, Starrcade 83, by having Harley Race leave the NWA right before the big show and bring the NWA belt to the WWF. Interesting considering the circumstances surrounding the Montreal Screwjob. That's another video for another day. According to Race, he and Vince met over dinner at a restaurant, and that Vince got so upset when Race told him no. He would not be satisfied with the man in the mirror if he did not do the right thing. Race said that Vince literally became so upset that he tried to shoot on Race and take him down with a single leg takedown. Apparently Race's wife had to separate them. That's classic Vince McMahon for you, if I've ever heard it. He's so fearless that he went after one of the toughest men in the history of the business at a restaurant while people are sitting there eating spaghetti and drinking wine. Through all of these tales of assassination plots, bounties being placed on his top star, and so much more, Vince ultimately triumphed when WrestleMania 1 hit cable circuit television on March 31st, 1985. The event was created as a counter to the aforementioned Starrcade from 1983. McMahon's knowledge of closed-circuit television that he acquired from promoting Evel Knievel's Jump years earlier gave him a better understanding of what not to do, thus making WrestleMania a huge success. WWE has often painted a picture of WrestleMania being a huge gamble, with McMahon and his wife Linda stating that they mortgaged everything that they had within the company to put on the event. Some have called into question that statement. Now, regardless of if it's true or not, McMahon took a huge risk in the sense of, had the event flopped, the WWF may not have been able to fully expand nationally. I'm convinced that McMahon would have found a way to succeed anyway. McMahon created his own rules and walked to the beat of his own drum. And anytime he was faced with adversity or his back was seemingly against the wall, he rose even higher. He was told that he couldn't pull out of the NWA by his father. He did it anyway. He was told that he couldn't run shows in other promoters' towns and that he couldn't poach talent away from them. He did it anyway. The early successes of the WWE simply could not have come to fruition without one ingredient. That is Hulkamania. Hulk Hogan took over the wrestling world from late 1983 until he left the WWE 10 years later in 1993. Hulk Hogan was the star that Vince needed to hitch his wagon to make the WWE into the brand that it is today. Whether you love him or hate him, Hogan is arguably the most important wrestler of all time. The rise of Hulkamania is certainly a topic for another day, but the story of Vince McMahon's rise cannot be told without making some mention of it. Hogan was in Rocky movies, he had action figures and commercials, other movies, you name it, Hulk Hogan did it. In the 1980s, Hogan was one of the central figures of pop culture. Everyone knew exactly who he was. He was that generation's Roman Reigns, but times 10 in terms of star power and recognition. Of course, there were some tremendous lows that came McMahon's way. The steroids trial of the early 90s nearly took down the WWF as McMahon was being charged with federal crimes in relation to possession and distribution of anabolic steroids to his wrestlers. This led to the new generation era being coined, which brought the WWE's business down to record lows that have not been seen since. These lows came after such tremendous heights that many wondered if wrestling peaked. And then the NWO was formed by Vince's own cash cow Hulk Hogan on the competing promotion of WCW. The formation of the NWO made wrestling relevant again in a way it hadn't been in a long time. In turn, WCW's successes forced McMahon's hand creatively as he made changes to his programming by ushering in the Attitude Era spearheaded by the beer-drinking redneck Stone Cold Steve Austin. On Austin's back, the WWF reached even higher heights than those achieved by Hogan, culminating in WWE becoming a publicly traded company on Wall Street on October 19, 1999. Simply put, this is one of the most significant days in wrestling history, and surely of McMahon's history. Just 17 short years after purchasing the WWF from his father, McMahon positioned the company to be traded on Wall Street. Simply unreal. After conquering Wall Street, the final mission for McMahon was to make the WWE a globally recognized brand, which came to be through the explosion of WrestleMania as wrestling's version of the Super Bowl. Through the power of social media, wrestling became easily accessible to everyone, and it could resonate with all countries because of the uniqueness of it all. Wrestling has always been a global entity, as it has a presence in Japan and Europe, to name a few places. Events like Once in a Lifetime, a match between John Cena and Hollywood's most famous actor at the time, The Rock, helped expand the WWE's reach even further. Eventually, they hit a point where they are running big shows in Puerto Rico, Scotland, Germany, and so many more on a regular basis. Vincent Kennedy McMahon was a pioneer in the pay-per-view and television world, and his vision made him the most powerful man in all of wrestling. However, with great power comes great responsibility, and in Vince's case, great controversy. WWE was riding high after the successes of WrestleMania 38, which included what will no doubt be McMahon's last wrestling match, when in July 2022, the Wall Street Journal dropped a bombshell of an article against McMahon stating that he paid out tens of millions of dollars in hush money payments to several women throughout his years atop the WWE. Shortly thereafter, McMahon would step down as the chairman and CEO of the WWE for a few months before he forced his way back using his status as the majority shareholder to support his efforts. His sole purpose for coming back would be revealed when rumors of the WWE being sold to one of many potential suitors that included Disney, Saudi Arabia, and Netflix. Then on April 3rd, 2023, the news broke that WWE had been sold to Endeavor Group Holdings, the parent company of the UFC, to form a sports and entertainment juggernaut. Vince had done it. He parlayed the $1 million he paid for the WWE from his father into $9.3 billion. That is an insane return on investment, to say the absolute least. Most wrestling fans, including myself, never thought that we would see the day when Vince sold the WWE. We all just assumed that he would die before he sold the company. The wrestling product had long been out of touch, and so many were clamoring for change, and that's just what we've gotten with Triple H in charge. However, none of this would have been possible without Vince McMahon. He is the man responsible for the sport that we all know and love, so I have to thank him for that. It's hard to believe that the man who triumphed through the steroids trial, made it through publicity nightmares like Owen Hart's death and the Chris Benoit tragedy, would have been taken down by a paralegal. This has been the story of the unlikely rise of Vince McMahon and the WWE from small-time territory to multi-billion-dollar entity. Stay tuned for part 2 of this documentary on Vince. Next time, I'll be looking deeper into his fall from grace. Until then, I'll talk to you on the next video. Thank you all so much for watching, and take care.